Okay, welcome to Child Psychology. We're starting our third week, and today we're going to be talking about the first 2 years of development, the first 2 years after birth, and we're going to be talking specifically about biosocial development. Basically, biological development, but other things that are biological, but they're also affected by the social environment. So let's do that now. This is what we're going to talk about: growth, nutrition. And then we'll get into brain development. That'll be heavily biological. We'll talk about neonatal states like sleeping and crying and things like that. Neonatal abilities, what infants can do. Motor development, which is movement. And neonatal problems, some problems that can come up where things actually have to do with immunizations mostly. There's not a lot there for neonatal problems. So let's get going. So let's talk first about growth. So during the first 2 years of life, growth and weight gain, is very rapid. Okay, children grow up very fast, especially during the first 2 years. It's when they grow the fastest. Okay, after birth, that is. It's when they grow the fastest. So a lot of rapid growth and weight gain during the first 2 years. Okay, some terminology here. You should know that the norm is just the average. So in that means the 50th percentile. So if you are average, or if your child is average, that means you're at the 50th percentile. That means that half of, so if your child is at the 50th percentile, that means half the children, let's say when it comes to height, would be taller, and half the children are shorter. So your child would be somewhere in the middle, right in the middle. Okay, that's the norm. Similarly for weight, are you in the 50th percentile? Where are you? Or are you higher than that? The norm, the average at birth, and we mentioned this before, is 7.5 pounds and about 20 inches tall. Okay, that's the average. And I mentioned before that how tall you are and how much you weigh when you are born isn't really indicative of how tall you're going to be when you are full grown. Not at birth, but later on there will be an approximation. We'll talk about that really soon. By the 4th month, weight doubles, okay? So children gain weight very, very rapidly. By their first birthday, their weight will have tripled usually. And by 2 years, the average, the average infant, or the norm you could say, is 30 pounds and about 34 inches tall. And the interesting thing is by 2 years, we can make an approximation when it comes to height. Your child's height at 2 years of age, if you double that, that's about as tall as they're going to be when they are full grown, give or take an inch or two. But yes, 2 years is a good approximation. Just double the height, and then that's likely how tall they're going to be. Weight gain during this time is mostly fat, and fat is useful actually. It helps children maintain warmth. And it's a store of nourishment. Fat is actually energy. And we carry that around basically as excess energy, excess fuel in the tank, you could say. So children grow very fast and they burn a lot of calories. And it's important that they actually gain weight quickly. And most of that will be fat because they're going to burn that as they get taller, as they get, as they develop. And there's something known as head sparing. What that means is that if nutrition is temporarily inadequate, then the body will stop growing, but not the brain. The brain is the most important thing when it comes to development. And if there's not enough nutrition, okay, if the child isn't getting enough calories, what will happen is the brain and the internal organs, the vital organs, will claim most of the nutrition, if not all the nutrition. And that means that the rest of the body won't really grow. Okay, there's a problem with your child if your child isn't growing very much or isn't really gaining weight. So because the brain is the most important, and if nutrition is inadequate, then the brain will be nourished at the expense of the other parts of the body. Let's keep going. Here's a chart for you guys so you can see how quickly children actually gain weight. And the title up there seems to be a little bit cut off, but you can still see the chart. But this is for boys and girls. Boys are the dotted lines there, and girls are the solid line. But so you can see when it comes to weight, boys that are in the 90th percentile, girls in the 90th percentile there. And you can see with the green lines, that will be a 10th percentile. The orange and brown lines there are for those in the 50th percentile. So you can see weight in pounds, that's what we use here in the US. Weight in pounds is on the right. And you can see the age in months at the bottom, the horizontal line there. And you can see how quickly children gain weight from being about an average of about 7.5 pounds, somewhere around there, depending on where your child is compared to others. And then you can see how quickly they grow. I mean, how quickly they gain weight. Okay, they grow up very fast, very rapidly. Okay, and that's just weight. I should probably also include there a chart for height, but I don't have it. I show one later at a different stage of development that shows you how quickly children actually gain height as well. Nutrition, okay. Yes, nutrition is always important, but it's especially important during, during those first 2 years. And for most infants, breastfeeding is what is going to provide that nutrition. It's been said that breastfeeding is best for about the first 4 to 6 months. And say breast is best, basically. That's what they say. First 4 to 6 months. Some mothers, of course, will breastfeed a lot longer than that, and some will breastfeed less. It depends. Usually what happens is you breastfeed your first child longer, and then by the time you get your second or third, you tend to cut them off earlier. You've learned that it's kind of okay. They don't have to breastfeed for a year or 2 years, but it depends. Average is 4 to 6 months. Actually, that's when it's the best. So infants get all the nutrition they need, all their needs, basically from breast milk. Okay, and it has several benefits for both infant and mother, for both mother and child. So there's a positive emotional feeling for the mother. There's that bonding, that skin-to-skin contact. You get to hold your baby, and you feed your baby, and your baby is satisfied, and then you get to bond. Basically, there's nothing like the bond between a mother and child. The father can't really compete, but he will form his own bonds, but it won't be as strong as the mother, and probably for this reason. There's also a reduced risk of breast cancer and osteoporosis for the mother. There's less illness, less disease, less allergic reactions for the infant, and that's because the infant will get a lot of the antibodies that the mother has through the breast milk. So, that's a very important benefit of breastfeeding. And of course, breast milk provides balanced nutrition for the infant. Many vitamins, many minerals. At the beginning, it's, everything the infant needs is provided through breast milk. And as the children get a little bit older, you can start introducing other foods. Okay, we'll talk about that right now. Okay, more about nutrition. So breast milk, it's best to breastfeed exclusively for the first 4 to 6 months, like I said. The breast milk will actually vary, okay? For the first 3 days, right after birth, breast milk is called colostrum, which is very thick, high-calorie milk. It's very thick, very high-calorie, and that's what infants need, okay? They need a lot of calories, they need a lot of fat, and they will gain weight very quickly. From 4 days to about the second week, it's called transitional milk. It's less concentrated, but still provides what the infant needs. You can start introducing other foods like cereals and fruits, things that are soft actually for the first 4 to 6 months. Be careful. What I mean by cereals, things that are soft, okay, or fruit, things that are soft. And, like those little things that people buy, the little Gerber baby food that provide, you can buy fruit, vegetables, cereals, and even things like, there might even be things in there that have meat and things like that. But usually fruits and cereals, things that are very soft, and especially that Gerber brand, and it tastes really good, and infants like it a lot. Cereals, I mean, you have to be careful there if you're just going to use cereals. It'd be something that is really soft when you mix it, let's say with, maybe with some breast milk or some water. You don't want to give children, by the way, real milk, okay, right away, not for like the first year. You know, you don't want to do that, okay? So, you know, cereals, maybe like, what is it that's called, that Rice Krispie, sometimes you mix it with some maybe breast milk or some water, something like that, and then it gets really soft, and you can feed them that. But I would stick to those baby foods that come in a jar, or the little plastic cups, okay? Children really seem to like that, and they will eat very little at the beginning, but then their appetite will grow for these, you know, less, well, for these more solid food, but it's still not really solid, it's soft. You can, you know, it's recommended that, you know, you breastfeed for about 1 or 2 years. Most people will breastfeed about that long, but like I said, you know, some people will not breastfeed much more than a couple of months, some 6 months, some a year or two, but it's good that you do it for about 1 or 2 years, but I can tell you that in poor countries, they tend to do it longer because nutrition is often inadequate in poor countries. So the way mothers keep their children healthy is by basically breastfeeding them longer. So it's not uncommon that in those countries, they'll breastfeed infants for 3, 4 years, or even longer. And there is some controversy about there are mothers who breastfeed their children even much longer than that. Even here in the U.S., you know, when it's not necessary, there have been in the past, some years ago, I've read stories about mothers who were, you know, still breastfeeding their children when they were like 7 years of age. Okay, that is shocking to some people, but if you keep breastfeeding, your breast will keep producing. And if you stop, by the way, they will dry up very quickly. So you can't stop and start, okay? You have to keep going if you want to continue breastfeeding. Formula can be adequate and more convenient, and it can be expensive, by the way, but usually people buy it in powdered form, and they mix it. You have to follow the instructions when it comes to mixing it, and you have to refrigerate it. But you can also, it can be a problem, you know, that's why people use formula, because often mothers have to go back to work within a short period of time. And, you know, you can, so you can use formula that's prepared ahead of time and leave it in the refrigerator for the, you know, for the babysitter or the father or whoever's taking care of the infant. Or if you drop them off at some daycare or something like that. But you can also actually pump your breast milk while you're at work. You know, if it's possible, you know, during your break, things like that, or during lunch. There's you know, there are breast pumps, and some are better than others. I can tell you the better ones are expensive. They cost hundreds of dollars, probably at least $200 or more. I mean, my wife hasn't done that in years, and I remember there were, you know, the good one was hundreds of dollars. And you can pump your breast while you're at work or when you're not breastfeeding, and then leave that breast milk there in a bottle in the refrigerator, so that can be then warmed up and, you know, and given to the infant while you're at work. So there's other things you can do, but most women will stop breastfeeding, of course, because of the lack of convenience, and it's different for different mothers. But like I said, you'll probably breastfeed your firstborn longer than your second and your thirdborn, if you should have a second and thirdborn. Okay, oops, a little bit too far here. I'm having some trouble. More about nutrition. There are those that do not get adequate nutrition. Okay, malnutrition is a problem elsewhere in the world, not really in the U.S. In the U.S., malnutrition is not really a problem. This is a very rich country, and even poor people usually get enough to eat. You know, there's help if you need it. There are services. So malnutrition isn't really a problem here. But in other parts of the world, it is. In other developing parts of the world, malnutrition can be a severe problem. And there's different kinds. One kind is protein calorie malnutrition, where the infant doesn't get enough consumption of food of any kind, and therefore they don't get enough proteins or enough protein or calories. About 8% of the world's children suffer from some kind of protein calorie malnutrition. Those numbers go down every year, because as the world develops, you know, countries seem to get richer, and then less children in those countries are malnourished. But protein calorie malnutrition can lead to problems. It can lead to severe weight loss, okay, where the children actually lose weight rather than gaining weight, severe illness and death, okay? It compromises the immune system, okay? Children just get weaker and then they can die. It will also cause stunting, which is basically when children don't grow enough or don't grow properly. So the children will be too short for their age. Okay, about 33% of the world's children suffer from some stunting, which means that if they had proper nutrition, they would be taller. And you see a lot of that, by the way, in countries, you know, like Latin America, for instance. I know that I'm from El Salvador, and I know when I go over there, you know, I consider myself short. I'm only about 5'7", but when I go, you know, to El Salvador, I feel normal. You know, I seem to be about average height over there. El Salvador is a very poor country, and you'll see that a lot of people are not actually that tall. And I spent my first 6 years in that country, so I was probably somewhat malnourished myself. I probably could have been a little bit taller. But when children grow up here in the U.S. and then they go visit their parents' country, let's say in Mexico or some other, or a poor country like El Salvador or something like that, you know, they'll go over there and people are surprised at how big, how tall they are. That's because a lot of the people in those countries are malnourished and they're not as tall. As countries develop, there is more food and children and people tend to get taller. India, for instance, has been developing rapidly over the last several decades and becoming a more powerful, a richer country. And Indian people are now quite tall, where they used to be short. The country's developing economically. They still have a bunch of poor people over there, but they also have a very large middle class, and they are developing very rapidly. The country's developing very rapidly, I should say, gaining economically very rapidly. A lot of smart people over there, and quite a large workforce of over 1 billion people. I think it's like 1.5 billion. Wasting is another problem caused by malnutrition, where children are severely underweight for their age. 2 standard deviations or more, that's a statistical thing. Don't worry about it too much. It means that basically, you know, if you weigh them, they'll be, you know, they won't even be close to the normal weight. Okay, about 25% of the world's children suffer from some kind of wasting, and they don't weigh enough, basically. And these problems are decreasing, you know, year after year, as the world develops, as the countries develop and they get richer, and then there's more jobs, and you know, and then nutrition gets better and more widespread, better nutrition, I should say, and more adequate nutrition. Chronic malnutrition is a problem. Chronic means that it's long lasting and it continues. That can cause some severe problems. If there's chronic malnutrition, the brain won't even get enough nutrients, won't get really what it needs. It's one thing, at first the body stops growing and the body starts wasting away when you don't get enough nutrition, because the brain and the vital organs will claim the nutrients. But if malnutrition continues, then the brain won't even get enough, and then the brain won't develop normally, and then learning ability, intelligence, things like that will suffer. Your child won't be as smart. It won't find it as easy to learn because of basically affected. The brain has been affected. Its development has basically been hindered. Disease is more lethal when there's chronic malnutrition. 50% of infant deaths around the world are usually due to chronic malnutrition. A lot of children die around the world, and about half of them that die is because they don't get enough to eat. It's actually that is a factor. Okay, that is something that you know, that makes it more likely that they're going to die, and they're going to die of some disease because the immune system will weaken. Merasmus is a type of chronic malnutrition where the body stops growing, the body's tissue wastes away, and the infant eventually dies. Okay, and Kwashiorkor is another type of chronic malnutrition. It's a protein deficiency. The face, the legs, and the abdomen will swell with water. So sometimes these infants will look like they're, you know, like they're well fed, but they're just swollen, and they're actually not, you know, not well fed. They're actually suffering from chronic malnutrition. The essential organs, you know, like the brain and the, you know, and the other organs in the body will claim the nutrients, and then the body will basically waste away. Their hair is usually thin and brittle and colorless. So sometimes they can look like they're blonde, but their hair is just colorless because they're suffering from severe malnutrition, and it's been long lasting. Let's keep going. Let's talk specifically about the development of the brain. So some biological things here, more specific biological things, and I'm going to have to summarize some things or review some things that you should have learned in Psych 101, or you should have heard something about already, and then we'll talk specifically about what happens during development. Point to make here is that the brain grows very rapidly, and it's about 75% of the adult weight by about age 2. By age 2, basically the infant's brain weighs about 3/4 of what it's going to weigh as an adult brain. Okay. We need to talk specifically about neurons. Okay. There are billions of them in your brain, and there's an image there of a neuron on the upper right that has all the basic parts. But neurons allow the brain areas to communicate with one another, and they allow the brain to process information. Neurons allow you to basically to think and to remember things and to move and walk and talk and do all those things that we do. Without these neurons, you really can't do anything. Without these neurons, you're just a bag of flesh, you could say. Okay, these neurons allow you to do the things that you do. About 70% of these neurons are actually in the cortex. The cortex is the the surface of the brain that you can see, the part that looks wrinkled, okay? And it contains the motor cortex, which controls movement, the somatosensory cortex, which has to do with the sense of touch, the auditory cortex, which understands sounds, and the visual cortex, which basically helps you understand what you're looking at. And there they are. So in order there, movement, feeling, and by feeling, I mean basically mostly it's the sense of touch. Okay, that's the somatosensory cortex. Hearing is the auditory cortex, and vision is the visual cortex. So 70% of those neurons are found in the cortex, that wrinkly part of the brain, that surface part of the brain that looks wrinkly. The brainstem controls heart rate, breathing, temperature. Okay, like those vital signs that they check when you first go to the doctor. That's the brainstem. That is the part of the brain where more toward the back, where the spinal cord connects. I believe should be an image coming up. But yeah, that's the brainstem. Controls heart rate, blood pressure, heart rate, breathing, temperature, all those things, blood pressure, all those things. Actually, I guess we don't have that image. So let's talk a little bit more about development. An important thing to know about neurons in the brain is that neurons undergo something called pruning. Okay, pruning in the real world, if you're talking about plants, it basically means you cut off like small branches off of a tree or a bush to stimulate growth. There's something similar that happens in the brain, pruning. Okay, what happens is that unused, unneeded neurons will wither away and die. And that is actually supposed to happen. You're born with more neurons than you actually need. And what happens is that the neurons compete for one another for basically for chemicals and for things so that that nourishes them. They compete for one another, and they form connections. And as they grow and form connections, they basically will be exposed to chemicals and things that help them grow. Those neurons that do not compete well, that basically don't form connections, the ones that aren't needed, will just wither away and die. Okay, and that is supposed to happen. Okay, Fragile X syndrome is actually a problem, that occurs when too many neurons survive. If too many neurons survive, the ones that are not needed actually get in the way of the ones that are needed. The ones that are forming those connections, they get in the way and they slow things down and they impair the functioning of the brain. So Fragile X syndrome will result in cognitive problems, learning problems, lower IQ, lower intelligence. That's what happens. And then the brains of these children will be a little bit larger, and their heads will be a little bit larger as well. A head that is larger than normal is actually indicative usually of that the child might have some problem. A head that's abnormally large or small usually indicates that there's some problem. Okay, you want a brain or a head in the normal range, and there can be a lot of variation, but usually these infants have heads that are too large if too many of those neurons survive. The ones that are not needed are supposed to wither away and die. It's called pruning. More about early brain development. Let's talk about those dendrites. Dendrites, if you well, actually, let me show you that image again. Dendrites are those things that look like branches. I know the image was kind of small, but you can see over here, these things that look like branches, those are the dendrites, okay? Their job is to detect chemicals, receive messages basically from other neurons. And then the soma will then process the signal, and the signal is sent down the axon to the terminal buttons, which will then release chemicals, neurotransmitters that will flow across to the next cell. So these neurons form connections, they communicate with one another. So let's go back and talk about these dendrites then. Dendrites are these branch-like structures, okay? They receive messages from other neurons, and the messages they receive are chemical messages. They're actually neurotransmitters that flow across from one cell to the next. So here you can see this thing that looks like a knob over here. That's called a terminal button. That is the end of a neuron, and then there's a gap between one neuron and the next. And this would be here the next neuron, the next cell, and this would be, you know, part of the dendrite. So the terminal button here will release neurotransmitters. They'll flow across, and they'll attach themselves to these things over here called receptors. And then gates and channels can open, allowing things to go into the cell. And basically that'll affect the voltage of the cell and results in the neuron either firing or not firing, sending a signal or not sending a signal. But these dendrites are, you know, basically receive messages from, the dendrites are the things that look like spikes, receive messages from other neurons. And the important thing to know here is that basically there's something known as transient exuberance. There's a 5-fold increase in the dendrites in the cortex by age 2. So these branches basically grow, you know, to basically make communication among neurons easier. They grow 5-fold. Think of it like the branches on a tree growing, okay? There's a 5-fold increase in that by age 2. So the brain is developing very rapidly. And of course, as these dendrites form, then more connections among neurons will be possible. And and you should know that the synapse here is the gap between one neuron and the other. That's the point of communication between neurons. Neurons will release neurotransmitters in order to communicate, okay? And important thing here about development is that experience enhances the brain. Thinking and learning require new connections among neurons. As your child grows and experiences the world, your child sees things, hears things, you provide toys, you feed your child, your child plays. All of this is stimulation for the child. And the development of the brain, the growth of these dendrites and the development of these synapses, the connections among neurons will be affected by the experiences of the child. But then again, also the biology also makes it possible for the child to actually do things and understand things. So it goes both ways. There's a two-way street here. The brain develops and affects experience, but experience also affects the brain. Let's keep going here. More about early brain development. You should know there are things that can be harmful for the development brain other than just, lack of nutrition. Stress hormones, for instance, especially cortisol, can be harmful, during those first couple of years. It can be harmful later on as well, but especially during those first couple of years. Too much stress hormones, too much, especially cortisol early in life, can lead to a child that's hyper vigilant, basically a child that, is always on edge, so to speak. Or maybe even an indifferent child. If the child learns to tune things out and learns to withdraw instead to cope with the stress, that can lead to an indifferent child. And both of those things will cause problems for the child academically when it comes to learning and interacting with other people. So you don't want to expose your child to too much stress early on. It's not a good idea if there's people coming and going a lot, if there's, if there's too many parties or violence, or if you move around too much and the circumstances are always changing, that can be stressful for the child. Some child handle the stress better than others, handle change better than others, but too much stress is actually a bad thing for the child. By 4 months, cell proliferation, the basically development of these connections among the neurons. So there's more self proliferation, more development of these neurons and the connections. And there's also pruning of vision and hearing areas. That takes place in the cortex. So by 4 months, the parts of the brain or the neurons basically that have to do with vision and hearing, the ones that aren't needed have been pruned, basically have withered away and died. So, you know, children are, by this time, they should be better at producing language, producing sounds, you know, and understanding language. We'll talk about language later, different chapter. But an important thing here is that if your child is blind or has trouble seeing, or your child, you know, has trouble hearing, those problems need to be diagnosed rather early, before 4 months. Because if they're not diagnosed early, then what happens is that those parts of the brain aren't really developing, or those neurons are being pruned, or they're withering away and dying before they have a chance to form connections, because there's a problem with vision and hearing. And then your child can be permanently impaired. So if your child needs glasses, or you know, or can't see very well, you know, or can't hear very well, you know, you need to find that out very early, and that needs to be corrected. And you'll get plenty of appointments. So just follow the doctor's orders. You'll have plenty of appointments when you have a newborn. There'll be, you know, lots of, you'll take your child in the first year to the doctor many, many times. Okay, there's a lot of checkups, a lot of appointments, so make sure you don't miss those. They'll check for all these things. By 6 to 24 months, language areas develop very rapidly. Okay, infants, of course, need to hear a lot of speech early. You need to talk to them, you know, and you know they need to hear a lot of things, and you know it's just part of development, right? Experience is necessary. Do not ignore your children. You need to talk to them. You need to interact with them, you know, and you know, sing songs, you know, they hear songs, play games, all those things, all these things will help them develop language, okay? Children that are basically raised by mothers who are, you know, less nurturing, you know, who don't talk to their children much and ignore who don't talk to their children much and ignore their children, will actually develop language much more slowly. So it's important that they get the proper stimulation. You need to talk to them and expose them to things. They hear sound, they sing songs, all those things. And if you're a good mother, a good parent, you will do these things instinctively for your child. There's a sensitive period when it comes to language. It was taught early on, decades ago, that that if children aren't exposed to language early on, that they will not develop language. But that's actually not true. That would mean that there's a critical period for language. But for language, we have more of what's called a sensitive period. There's a time when a certain aspect of development is more likely to occur. So between 6 and 24 months, it's a sensitive period for language. Language is developing very rapidly. So the child needs to get a lot of stimulation, hear a lot of language, for language to develop at the right, you know, at the right pace and to develop properly. If the child is not exposed to a lot of language, or is deprived, or you know, kept in the dark or something like that, and the child is neglected, then the child will be you know, impaired when it comes to language, will be very behind. But that doesn't mean they cannot develop language. They can still develop language, but they will be slower at developing language, and it'll, you know, it'll take them a lot longer to catch up. They will be behind. Let's keep going. There was you know, some research here that I should tell you about the importance of experience in the brain, the importance of providing an enriched environment. There was an experiment that was done with rats. Some rats were raised in an enriched environment, and some rats were raised in a deprived environment. Now, the rats raised in an enriched environment, to tell you more about this, basically had a big cage. They had other rats there. They had little tunnels and wheels and things they can play with, you know, as well as food and water. So it was like a, you know, like a large play area for the rats, basically. And then there were rats that were raised in a deprived environment, an impoverished environment. They were kept in a smaller cage by themselves. They had food and water, but not much else. There wasn't much for them to play with. There weren't tunnels or little wheels or anything like that. You know, these rats were raised differently. And then later on, of course, you know, they looked at the rats' brains. You know, they killed them, you know, and they looked at their brains. And it turns out that the rats that were raised in an enriched environment had larger, heavier brains, more dendrites. They seem to have basically benefited from that enriched environment, from, you know, that additional stimulation. And those rats were probably smarter. Now, I don't know how you test the IQ of rats, the experiment didn't say that, but they had larger, heavier brains with more dendrites, meaning their brains are more fully developed. Now you can't really do that to humans, but there are things that have happened to children, you know, throughout the ages that are horrible that we can study to know how basically how neglect and poverty and having an enriched, having a basically an inadequate environment can, you know, delay the development of the brain or, you know, impair the development of the brain. In Romania in the 1980s, their leader at the time encouraged people to have a lot of children for some reason. And basically what happened is too many children were born, and then there was about 100,000 children who ended up in orphanages, and these orphanages were very crowded. They didn't have enough orphanages to basically take care of all these children. So children were neglected. There weren't enough people to take care of them. They weren't properly fed. I mean, it's like these children were in prison to some extent, you know. They really, you know, wasn't much there for them. And some of those children were adopted before 6 months. And those that had a normal IQ by age 11. They were a little bit behind, but they were normal by about age 11. Remember, 6 to 24 months is like a sensitive period of language development. Those that were adopted after 6 months, they had an average IQ of about 85, which means they're below average intelligence. By age 11, that's what their IQ was. And they were more, you know, they were behind, more severely affected. So, you know, you want to raise your kids in an enriched environment. It doesn't mean you have to be rich, but you need to provide stimulation for these children. You need to, you know, talk to them, sing songs, let them play, you know, buy them toys where they touch things and they experience all these things. You know, they grab them and they play with them, take them to the park when they're old enough. Okay, by the way, at this age, you know, they don't need to go to the park yet the first 2 years, but you know, you need to provide stimulation. And the sad thing is, if you're wealthy, you know, it's a lot easier to provide those things than if you're poor. Well, that'll come up again when we talk about, you know, basically having an adequate environment for children and how that affects their development. Harming the infant brain. So here's the thing, there's a lot of things that have to do with proper brain development, and when it does, you know, when things go wrong, you know, the infant brain will be delayed in development and will be harmed. Children need the necessary stimulation, so they need to be able to play, you know, they need varied sensations, they need to hear different things and touch different things and taste different things, right? They need to play and sing songs and all these different things. Even watching TV, which a lot of people consider harmful, that's visual stimulation. They shouldn't do it for hours and hours on end, but you know, there's tablets or smartphones, all these little things that you can do, but there's other things that children should do. I mean, they should do things live rather than watching it on a tablet or on a phone or on a TV. But they need to play, they need to touch things and hear lots of language and sing songs, get proper nutrition. All that is part of the necessary stimulation that children need. You know, you hold them and play with them and talk to them, play games with them, all that stuff. Stress in the brain, we mentioned a little bit about stress already. An overabundance of stress hormones can cause damage to brain functioning. Severe social deprivation has happened in Romania during the 1980s. Isolation, sensory deprivation will harm the developing brain. Just like we saw in the experiment with rats, you extrapolate that to humans. Similar things can happen in humans that we've learned from not just the example in Romania, but it's happened many times where children have been isolated, deprived. Sometimes they have really bad parents who keep them locked in a closet and don't really give them more than food and water. And there's been some horrible things that have happened to children. And we've learned from that social deprivation, providing children of necessary stimulation, being with others and going to school and all those things is very harmful to the developing child, to the developing brain. Intervention, well, here's the thing. You know, you should never shake a baby. There's something known as shaken baby syndrome. It's a life-threatening injury, okay, that happens when an infant is forcefully shaken back and forth. Shaking them back and forth will rupture blood vessels in the brain and break neural connections, will damage the brain. Okay, here's the thing, infants, newborns will frustrate you, okay? You probably won't do that if you're a parent, but you know, if there's somebody else raising your child and that child is, that person who's raising your child is very mean and is very frustrated and they shake your baby, you know, they can damage the infant's brain. So you don't want that to happen to your child. Okay, so don't do that. Let's keep going here. Let's talk about neonatal states now. Neonatal states. Here's the thing, newborns alternate between different states of mind, okay? 4 states, they can be undergoing what's called alert inactivity. That means they're awake, they're calm, they're attentive, looking around, their eyes are open, and it's as if they're inspecting the environment, but they're not really moving around, they're not really jiggling or anything like that, okay? They're just lying there still, looking around. They're attentive and they're calm, they're awake. There's also waking activity where their eyes are open, but they seem unfocused, and they're moving their arms and legs and bursts of uncoordinated activity where they seem to be active. They seem to be, something has stimulated them, and then they're moving around, and their eyes are kind of moving around too, but they don't seem very focused. Crying happens a lot. Babies cry very often, okay? It's the primary way they communicate with you. They cry to tell you that they're basically hungry, that they're cold, that they're too warm, that they're scared, that they're in pain. That's how babies communicate with you, and they will cry a lot, very, very often, okay? And it's just something you have to deal with, okay? It's very difficult to take care of newborns. And then there's sleeping. Infants sleep a lot. Most of what they do is sleep, okay? But when they are awake, yeah, they're very hard to handle. But let's talk more about sleeping. So newborns actually sleep a lot. Most of what newborns do is actually sleep, okay? They sleep about an average to 15 to 17 hours a day, okay? And that is normal. And that sleep is necessary for growth and proper development, for proper growth of the body and development of the brain. A lot of that sleep is REM sleep, where their eyes are moving back and forth under their eyelids. That's correlated with dreaming, but we don't know if infants are really dreaming because, well, they can't really tell us. But we do know that they have REM sleep. Their eyes are moving back and forth. First, by 3 to 4 months, they develop a slow wave sleep, which is not REM sleep. It's just basically when they are in deep sleep, and their eyes are not really moving back and forth. Regular ample sleep is very important. It's correlated with brain maturation, right? It helps the brain develop normally. Learning, emotional regulation, psychological adjustment in school, and adjustment with family. A child that is not sleeping well will be very grouchy, very irritable, won't grow well, won't be able to focus and learn very well. And it will affect, the growth and development of the brain. So it's very important. And when you take your child for all those checkups, the doctor will weigh the child and will measure the child. And if your child is growing normally, it's usually an indication that the child is also getting enough sleep. Growth hormones are actually released during sleep, growth hormone. It's needed, of course, for the rapidly growing infant. Okay, if your child isn't sleeping very well, your child probably isn't growing very well either. The good news about sleep is that by about age 1, infants will sleep kind of like will develop the pattern of the family. Okay, will basically get sleepy and fall asleep at around the same time the family members do, and will wake up around the same time. About 80% of all 1-year-olds will actually sleep through the night. But at the beginning, they don't sleep through the night. They're not supposed to. At the beginning, they sleep a lot, but they also wake up crying and they want to be fed, and you feed them around the clock. You breastfeed them around the clock, and they keep you up at night. It's very hard to raise newborns, raise children in general. But by about 1 year of age, about 80% of them will actually develop the sleep pattern that, that you want them to have, one that's like yours, okay? So that you can actually sleep, okay, when they sleep, and then they're awake when you're awake. But it doesn't happen with all children. Some children don't sleep through the night until much later. My son and daughter both drove us crazy when they were newborns. Of course they kept us up all night. They needed to be fed, and they cry, and they wanted to be with us all the time, and we couldn't get much sleep. It actually took them about 2 years for them to actually sleep through the night. They both drove us nuts. It was very, very difficult, and you get very sleep deprived, you get very grouchy, and then there's a lot of arguing, you know, because of that. It's very hard to raise these newborns. It gets easier as they get a little bit older, but then, you know, there's other challenges that come up. Something else I need to mention that's very important is sudden infant death syndrome. It's a very sad thing that happens, very devastating thing. It's also called SIDS. It's basically when the child just dies suddenly while they're sleeping. They stop breathing and they die. It happens about 1 out of every 400 infants in the U.S. Those numbers can vary a bit depending on what else is happening. But it's recommended that you put infants to sleep on their backs. Don't put them on their sides or on their bellies. Put them on their backs. And you should not really have all these bunch of stuffed animals there with them or all these fuzzy blankets. You need to make sure that they have proper pajamas and that they, you know, you put them to sleep on their backs. You can have a blanket for them and stuff like that, but make sure that they don't have, you know, that it's, you know, that it's so fluffy or that it's basically suffocating them, or you know, that they can suffocate them. But it's recommended you just put them on their backs and you don't cover them. Okay. There was a study that was done where they recommended that parents put infants to sleep on their backs, and follow-up showed that basically when stomach sleeping decreased from 70% to 24%, SIDS dropped from 1.2 per 1,000 to about 0.07 per 1,000. So the rate of SIDS basically dropped by almost half. If, you know, when the study that they did when they encouraged basically parents to put their infants to sleep on their backs. About 70% of children were being put to, you know, to basically to bed on their stomachs, you know, and then they encouraged to put them to sleep on their back. So that dropped 24%, and then SIDS dropped a whole lot. I can tell you more about SIDS. SIDS seems to be a lot more common, you know, when children are basically not able to roll over. Your child at the beginning, your newborn, can't really do very much. You put them on their back, they're going to stay on their back. You put them on their belly, they're going to stay on their belly. Okay. As they get older, they will learn to be able to roll over on their belly, on their back. They'll be able to get to hold their neck up for longer periods of time as they get older. But at the beginning, they can't really hold their heads up very much. So if you put them on their tummy, they will eventually get tired and their face will be, you know, flat against the, you know, against the mattress. And SIDS seems to decrease dramatically after about after about 7 months of age, because that's around the time that infants basically learn to roll over. They roll on their bellies, they can roll back onto their backs, and then that seems to make SIDS a lot less likely. It's not just that infants are suffocating. Sometimes infants just seem to stop breathing for what seems to be no reason at all. And it's very devastating for the parents. And it happened, and this thing happens enough that it causes a lot of heartache for parents. But there are some precautions you can take. A lot more information about that, but just a little bit something you should know. What about co-sleeping? What about sharing a bed with your infant? Okay. You can see the chart over here on the right, percent co-sleeping, how often it's done. And you can see that co-sleeping happens a lot more in cultures that are more collectivist, you know, in China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, in the Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, Vietnam. Yeah, it happens much more among those cultures and among cultures that are more collectivist, that are more, they're just more, how should I say, more family oriented. They're more about the group, less about the individual. In more individualistic cultures like the US and Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, basically the white Western world, you can call it, co-sleeping is not encouraged as much. It's encouraged that you put your baby on a crib by him or herself, and you put them in a separate room so that you can actually sleep. Okay. But in Asia, Latin America, and African countries, the mothers worry more about their children being left alone, and so they're more likely to sleep next to them on the same bed. European and North Americans worry more about privacy and being able to sleep, you know, and being able to have sex, you know, and therefore the children goes in a crib in another room usually. And you can have little baby monitors and stuff like that so you can hear if the baby wakes up. You check them then on them often. But yeah, there's less co-sleeping in the U.S. Some important some cohort differences. There's some good and bad things about co-sleeping. Pros are the good things. If you sleep next to your infant, you can respond a lot more quickly. If your child should basically be hungry or be cold or something like that, you can respond more quickly. And you're likely to develop a stronger attachment, more responsive attachment. They're with you for more hours of the day, and they get even more attached to you, which is not bad. You want your children to be attached to you. Cons, and this varies. There can be a higher risk of SIDS if you sleep with your infant. You may suffocate them or roll over on top of them. But more recent research shows that it's not really much of a risk. That most people who sleep next to their infants are very aware of their infants. They know they're there. And it's only if one parent is like drunk or on drugs or something like that. It's only under circumstances like that that they can harm the child. They may forget the child's there and roll over on top of them and basically suffocate them. And children are more likely to have sleep problems, and also the parents, if you sleep with your children, because they wake up very frequently, and they'll wake you up, or you notice when you sleep next to them, you notice every single little movement when they move, when they shift, and they wake you up, and you check on them. So, you'll have more sleep problems. And they will also be less likely to sleep through the night because they're used to having you there and responding to them, all the time. As opposed to having them in the crib, let them sleep, and you sleep in your own room, and sometimes you wake up when they cry, and when they wake up, sometimes you don't, and basically, they're more likely to learn to sleep through the night if they're in their own crib, in their own room. Other abilities when it comes to, let's talk about neonate abilities now. Those were neonatal states of mind. Now abilities, neonate abilities. And by the way, the neonate, that means newborn. Neo means new, nate means born, okay? The abilities of the newborn, okay? Well, at the beginning, there's not much there other than basically what we call reflexes, okay? And those have to do with their senses. Children have all their senses from the beginning. Okay, they can see, they can hear, they can taste, they can touch, they can smell. They're all present at birth, but they are immature. Their sense of vision, their hearing, their taste, all that stuff, smell, all these things will get better with experience and with development of the brain. But their senses are all present at the beginning. Turns out that infants can see best for objects that are about 4 to 30 inches away. And that's important because when you hold the child, that's about the length that you are away from your child. If you have them up close, they might be like 4 inches away, or if you hold them at arm's length, they're only about 30 inches away. So that's how far infants can see best. And it's good because that's the kind of interaction they get at the beginning at that distance. Infants also prefer to look at human faces. There's something in the brain about that, of recognizing their own kind. Experience, of course, and maturation of the visual cortex, the part of the brain that allows you to understand what you're looking at, will improve their ability to recognize shapes and to scan the environment, to look around and to see details they otherwise would have missed. And as they get older and with experience, yes, the brain will develop and they will become a lot better at understanding things and playing with things. And just, basically just they'll learn as their brain develops and as they experience things. Binocular vision develops by about 3 months, which means that their eyes basically can be in alignment and can focus on an object, and they are in sync. Before 3 months, the children may seem kind of cross-eyed, where one eye is looking in one direction and another eye is looking somewhere else. They haven't yet developed binocular vision, the ability of their eyes to basically to be in sync and look in the same direction for them to focus on an object with both eyes. That doesn't mean they're always cross-eyed, by the way. But sometimes you'll notice that they look cross-eyed. Hearing. Hearing actually develops during the last trimester of pregnancy. It's the most advanced of the newborn's senses. They can hear very well. Okay, sudden noises startle them and will make them cry. Okay, familiar rhythmic sounds like the heartbeat are soothing to them, and they are exposed to that. While they're in the mother's womb, they hear the mother's own heartbeat, and that is soothing to them. But, things that are familiar, to them, familiar sounds, the voice of their own parents, certain sounds that they get used to will become soothing to them. As long as they're rhythmic, they repeat over and over again. Speech perception they have some kind of speech perception by about 4 months after birth. So by about 4 months, they will recognize speech. They can't necessarily produce it, but they can recognize speech, as opposed to just, other sounds because of the interactions they have with their parents. Other abilities, so infants can hear, okay? At birth, they can listen, right? Not very long, but, they can listen, and they can localize sounds at birth. They'll hear a sound and they might look in that direction or turn their head in that direction, knowing that they know where the sound is coming from. That's localization of sound. Infants will learn to recognize the caregiver's smell and touch. Okay, so they are capable of learning. They learn, they recognize these things, and they also have their sense of taste. Taste of sugar will actually calm a 2-week-old. 2-week-old might be crying. You give them a little bit of sugar, and that will actually calm them down. 4-week-olds can also be calmed by, some sugar if they are crying, but it also requires some reassurance from, a human face. So you don't just give them sugar, but you also look at them nicely, and that'll calm them down. The senses are used primarily for interaction with their caregiver, with the mother or the father, and for comfort, for soothing themselves. That's what they use their senses for. Their sense of touch is very soothing, for instance, but so is that sense of smell and the sounds that they hear. And you can see a picture here of this little girl, starting on the lower left there. She puts, it looks like a wedge of a lemon in her mouth. And then you can see by the second picture that she doesn't like it very much. And then by the third picture, you can see her reaction, right? She really can't detect that sour taste. Okay. And of course, as they get older, they'll learn to, to like that taste, as long as it's, it also has some sugar, But yeah, all their senses are present. They're just going to mature and get better as they get older. Let's talk about movement now. There's 2 kinds of movement. There's gross motor movement and fine motor movements. It's important that you know the difference. Gross motor movement involves large bones and muscles. So waving your arms, moving your legs, things like that, that's gross motor movements. Large bones, large muscles. What can infants do that are actually gross motor movements? They can't do very much early on, but by 5 months, they can wiggle, they can move forward by using their arms, shoulders, and legs. And will eventually begin to crawl. Some children crawl before others. By 8 to 10 months, they can crawl by lifting their midsection, using their arms and legs. We'll look at a chart to see, when the average is. So that's 8 to 10 months. By 12 months, they can learn to climb on couches. They'll pull themselves up, and they'll be able to stand, by holding onto a couch or a chair. By 16 months, most of them are already walking, and then they'll eventually begin, walking will turn into, first they will be kind of hesitant, and they're likely to fall, okay? And then they'll become more coordinated and quicker, and then they'll start running. They'll be clumsy at first, and then they'll get a lot better at that. Some ethnic differences here. Walking and running is acquired earlier by African American children. So there is some truth to the stereotype that African Americans are just better at physical movement, better at sports. You can see they dominate sports, and early on you can see that they have an advantage when it comes to movement. By the second, by Hispanics, Latinos acquired walking and running second, and then those of European descent are basically slower to walk and to run. That doesn't mean that all Europeans will take a long time to learn how to walk and how to run, or that all African Americans will walk very early. These are just averages, okay? Your child can be anywhere, okay? My son, took about 13 months or so, basically, to start walking. And some children can start walking as early as like 9 months. Okay, my daughter also about about a year. It took her about maybe a year, maybe 13 months as well to start walking. So it depends. It depends on, on genetics. It also depends on stimulation and how many and the opportunities you provide them, basically to, to play and to actually move and crawl. And most parents provide enough stimulation when it comes to that. There's also fine motor movement. Fine motor movement involves basically movement of small bones and muscles. By 2 months, infants will, can kind of wave and stare at dangling objects. And I mean by wave, it's not very coordinate, but they'll try to, basically move their little arm, and it looks like they're waving, but they're not really waving at you, but they can move like that. By 3 months, they will touch an object. Okay, they'll reach and touch an object. Okay, by 4 months, they can grab the object, but their timing can be a little bit off. They'll try to extend their hand and try to grab it, and sometimes they will miss. Okay, by 6 to 9 months, they'll reach, grab, and hold any object of the right size, anything they can put in their little hands. Okay, and by 1 year, they'll master the pincer movement. The pincer movement with the fingers is when you put basically your index finger and your thumb together. Okay, so first they master that with their hands, putting their hands together like that, and then with their fingers, and then eventually learn to use utensils. By 2 years, grabbing becomes more selective, as they learn rules about what they are allowed to touch and what they're not allowed to touch. But that's all fine motor movement. It's movement that involves small bones and muscles. So usually using their fingers, and their hands. Here's a table that you can look at here about when children develop certain things. When 50% of babies can master a certain skill, that's the first column there of numbers. And then when 95%, master the skill, that's the second column of numbers. So when the infant can basically sit with their head steady, right? At the beginning, when you put your infant, you can't just put your infant there on the couch and expect that they're not gonna fall over. They fall over. But by about 3 months, 50% of infants, basically about half of them, can sit there and keep their head steady. By 4 months, 95% of infants can do that. Sit unsupported, which means you can sit them there on the couch and they're not leaning on something. There's, their back is not resting against the couch, or their sides are not resting against the side of the couch. They can sit unsupported. By 6 months, 50% of infants can do that. By 7 months, 95% can do that. And you can see when they can pull to a stand. And my daughter was right on, basically on time with these things. I remember her pulling up on things by 9 months. Okay, 95% can do it by 10. Standing alone, when they walk well, basically 13 months, by 15 months, 95% of infants can do it. When they can run and jump, those kind of things, you can see, how they develop. And if you have an infant or you remember what they were like, you can kind of compare here. But even if they seem to be a little bit behind, they will catch up. My son's on the autism spectrum, so it took him a little bit longer to do certain things. He started walking and crawling and more or less at the right time on average, but he wasn't doing it very well. Like when he started to crawl, he wasn't really crawling. He was kind of scooting on his butt, and then he eventually learned how to crawl properly. And it just takes him a little bit longer to learn things, to learn, how to basically. It took him a little bit longer, like to walk properly and then run and do all those things. Whereas my daughter was more coordinated, but then again, she's not on the autism spectrum. Dynamic systems underlie motor skills. There's 3 important things that all interact to allow basically the development of these motor skills, of these movements. One of those is muscle strength, right? And as the children get older, their muscles will get stronger, okay? Another one is the maturation of the brain, the development of the brain. And the development of the brain is affected by everything, basically, by experience, by nutrition, okay, and by genetics. So that's part of it as well. And then practice. You need to provide opportunities for your child to crawl and pull themselves up and try to walk if they're at that stage already. They will fall and hurt themselves sometimes. Sometimes they'll cry, but you need to make sure they have a safe place where they can practice that. But they usually don't fall over and hurt themselves very badly, okay? They'll usually fall and they'll fall on their butts, But sometimes, yes, they can hit their heads and get a scratch or maybe even bleed, and you get concerned, but it's usually not a big deal. And their brain is very well protected, okay? If they do fall, they're not falling from a great height, they're trying to stand or walk. But yes, they can get hurt, but you have to watch them and try to be there to catch them. Just make sure they're not trying to crawl over the edge of a table or something like that, or crawling down the stairs. They'll eventually know how to crawl down the stairs, but just make sure that it's safe. And you might need to provide little gates so they don't go off, try to go up the stairs and then tumble down, or go where they shouldn't. Let's keep going. Neonatal problems. There are children who will have problems that have to do with biosocial development. One of those problems is called failure to thrive. There's other problems. We already talked about malnutrition, but failure to thrive is one of these problems where infants will be at the bottom 3% when it comes to height and weight. So they're at the bottom, okay? That means 90% of infants their age are taller and weigh more than they do, okay? Which means that there's something wrong usually. What the problem could be organic, which means it's something biological. They might have some gastrointestinal disease, which doesn't, which they cannot absorb nutrients properly and therefore are not growing properly. Their nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, there might be a problem there, because they're, it's not, the brain is not developing properly. So there could be some biological problem. It could also be due to illness or disease. I knew of one little girl, for instance, who had leukemia, and she was undergoing treatment, chemotherapy and things like that. It was affecting her, and she wasn't failure to thrive, but she was like at the bottom, like 10%, because these treatments were affecting her ability to absorb nutrients, and then radiation is obviously harmful. There's also non-organic causes to failure to thrive: poverty, neglect, malnutrition. Basically, your child is not getting enough food or enough proper food. The child is being neglected and not being fed or cared for properly. That can cause those problems as well. And like I said, the organs, especially the brain, will claim the nutrients, and then the body will basically suffer, and the children won't really grow. 50% of these children who are in this at this level, right, on the bottom 3%, will have physical, cognitive, and behavioral problems. They'll have physical problems. It won't be as big as they could be. They won't grow as big. Cognitive problems with the development of the brain and learning and memory and things like that, and behavioral problems as well. Less able to regulate their emotions, all sorts of things, and that can be due not just to the physical things, but the neglect or maybe even abuse that might have been occurring. Immunizations. One last slide. Immunizations. It's important that your child get all the immunizations. Okay, and it's important that you take your child for checkups to the doctor. Keep your appointments. There's going to be a lot of them the first year. During the first year, they want to see, your baby all the time. And then after the first year, a little bit less, but still frequently. But there's less and less as the child gets bigger. But there's going to be a lot of checkups, a lot of appointments. And along the way, your child will get immunizations. Usually some kind of vaccine or a small dose of the active virus to stimulate production of antibodies. It's important that they get these immunizations. There's immunizations for measles, for whooping cough, pneumonia, and a whole bunch of other diseases and other things that basically devastated children's lives, that basically ended a lot of children's lives, but no longer. Very few children actually die from those things now. Okay. And I am aware that there's this anti-vaxxer movement that some people believe immunizations cause autism, and some parents don't want to get their children immunized. That is a very, very bad thing to do, okay? It's just you're putting your children at risk. And because of that, because there's this movement, okay, and our president hasn't been very good in basically telling these people to, that they should get their kids immunized, and has more or less encouraged them. Because of this, children now are suffering from these diseases, these illnesses that have long ago been wiped out, and then more children are dying from these things because of that. If you are denying your child immunization, you're putting your child's life at risk. It's as simple as that. There's been decades of research that shows that immunizations actually work, okay? They're not causing autism, okay? The point of view that says, or that one study that supposedly showed that, you know, the immunization may be causing autism, that was a flawed study. The guy who started that basically committed fraud and had to admit later on that he faked it. It was fraud. It was not basically good science, and he lost his degree and his job because of that. And he started this nonsense of this anti-vaxxer movement that is putting a lot of children at risk now, okay? Please don't be a dummy, okay? Listen to the experts, okay? There's no vaccines available yet for AIDS, for malaria, for cholera, typhoid, shigellosis, right? Anything like that. Shigellosis is where a bacteria that attacks the stomach, you know, and produces bloody diarrhea. It's important that your children get the, you know, their immunizations to keep them healthy, and so they can go to school, okay? Because they are required for your children to attend school. At least here in California, they might have waivers in other places, you know. But here, I believe it, you know, if you want to keep, you don't want your children to get their immunizations, and they're putting other children at risk, and you probably have to, you know, homeschool them. Which there's a lot more of now, homeschooling, because of the pandemic, and a lot of children are not really going to school, they're doing remote learning, so a lot of parents actually pulled their children out of school and are homeschooling them instead. Okay, that's it, you guys. Let me stop the recording.